and East New York, this is generally the neighborhood in terms of where the 2501 Pitkin Avenue pin is. If you were to sort of draw a circle around there, Cypress Hills is the northern tier of East New York, which is above Atlantic Avenue. To the east of us is Queens, to the north is Ridgewood, Bushwick, and to the west is Bed-Stuy, Brownsville. South will eventually hit the water. So that's where Cypress Hills in East New York is, so everyone has an idea of where we're looking. As the previous speakers mentioned, I'm going to give some sort of ground context to how some of these issues are playing out and what we see as some of the constraints and opportunities for moving forward. So what I wanted to show up front was this project. It's 2501 Pitkin Avenue. It's Pitkin Avenue and Berriman Street. This is the proposed site, as you see in the middle of the screen. It's on the corridor of Pitkin Avenue with the side street of Berriman Street. And here's some images of what is there right now, except for the fact that there's now a construction fence and we've started construction. But there's not a whole lot happening on Pitkin Avenue. And I will note that I can't point here, but on the top left image, there's a home with a red door. Many years ago, an old NHP project for small homes, for home ownership program. We actually worked on that project. So now we're building a rental next to a project that we did many years ago, which is interesting. And then this is a rendering of what the building will look like, generally. This is a 60-unit multifamily rental housing building with a supermarket on the ground floor. So I'm going to take it back to first slide. I'll just leave it there. So this conversation about zoning and food, I feel like I could talk about this for 5 hours straight. So putting this together today was a little bit challenging. I had many points that I wanted to try to cram into a small amount of time. And when I think about zoning, I sort of think of the Matrix. We've all seen the Matrix, right? And you have these letters and numbers, and they make sense to some people and not to others. And so for me, it's this kind of cohesion of density and financing. And I think those are what's at the root of where the opportunities are in bringing in a whole new way, food to this equation. So this project, the Pitkin Berriman development, is a project that was essentially worked on as a pilot with the city, approximately starting 5 years ago, to rethink that corridor area of East New York. Because if you go west down Pitkin Avenue in Brooklyn, there's a thriving commercial corridor with housing above. And then it sort of peters out, and there's very little. And there's a lot of vacant sites, blighted sites, contaminated sites. And so we approached this site with the notion that we would try to kickstart a commercial revitalization on Pitkin Avenue on the eastern end of that corridor. And we have history in doing this before, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about the organization because I really want to focus on this issue. But succinctly, we do a lot of different things that are all aimed at essentially anti-poverty and improvement of Cypress Hills in East New York. We have 22 offices across Cypress Hills and East New York. We have about 450 employees at any given time. And so this work is on Pitkin Avenue, is situated within the work that we've done on Fulton Street, which also was a very distressed, somewhat commercial corridor, which now is increasingly becoming a more successful commercial corridor by way of being a real asset to the community. And it still has some ways to go, but we've put in about 20 years worth of work, and you can really see the benefits. And so, so one aspect of this is about the commercial, but the other is, and I really don't want to extract food from housing because I think that they're so important to one another, that in order to be able to build on that lot, in order to be able to have fresh food on that lot, you need some economies of scale. And what I mean by that is that you do have to finance construction, and it's very difficult to do. So every time I see a project in the city going up, I think there are probably 300 people working on that. There's millions of dollars. It's amazing it actually happened. And so similarly, in order to make this work, we really did need more density. We've done a lot of housing over 30 years, and we've done small and medium, and each time, in order to make the financing work, in order to actually get the money to build the building, it's really hard to meet HPD's requirements for what your cost per square foot is for construction without building a lot of units at once. And so being able to increase the density and increase the number of units built on that site was critical to making the entire project happen and be viable. So we worked with the city to go through a ULURP process, which is effectively a rezoning process, as Daniel mentioned, as it's happening across the city, and you can do it on a smaller scale and a larger scale. So in and around that site, we increased the density that was allowable. And at the time, that was under the Bloomberg administration. We worked very closely with the commissioner, Amanda Burden, at that time, to not approach this just as a project, but as a sort of conceptual framework for what could be the future of this neighborhood or this section of the neighborhood. And fast forward, we're starting construction. We started construction a couple weeks ago. And by the time the project is built and there is a fully functional, operating, smallish supermarket, it will be 7 years. So I think it's important to think about the types of impacts that can be made and their relationship to scale and time, and that the issues that were outlined around equity and disparities require demand and supply solutions or tactics, and they require an investment in both short-term, medium-term, and long-term solutions. And I think that that's very important for this conversation about zoning, because zoning is about land use and land economics, and those changes are very important, and they serve as literally the mapping of a community. But they obviously don't address every issue. So it's a matter of ensuring that there's supportive, supplementary, and complementary programming to these developments. And so when Daniel talks about the community involvement, I feel that that's one of the most important takeaways from here, because, you know, as I'm outlining this and speaking to you, I obviously can only speak chronologically, and so I don't know if anyone has been following the recent developments in physics about spooky action and time and place connection, but time actually can go backwards and forwards and be moving at the same time. And so if I could talk in that way, I would talk about planning and design and economics and so forth at the same time, and I can. But this project is so multi-layered in that way, and so to condense in sort of the time that we have, I want to note that the project came from somewhere, right? So many of you may be thinking, well, where does this even come from, aside from these long-term visions that I outlined? But we had both a mission and a funding on the Brownfield Opportunity Area, the BOA program grant, where you look at an entire neighborhood, you look at brownfields, vacant sites, contaminated sites, and you think about how through the built environment you can address issues of a community, but then of course you have to bring in all of the non-built environment, the policy, the programming, and so forth. We worked with a Promise Neighborhood Planning Grant, so we're a Promise Neighborhood as well. We have a Verde initiative as an agency around sustainability, and that spans indoor air quality and energy efficiency and food and so forth. So we have these initiatives where we don't really think of it so much as community outreach. It's sometimes, that term is sometimes used, but community work. So we're a community-based organization. Our organization is founded and still operated over 30 years later by community members. And we take the cues from the community, so we work with community. This site was really designed and planned and programmed for the community. We did one-on-one meetings with community members. We did small-scale charrettes with community members, residents, business owners, youth, families, parents, seniors. We did large town hall type and summit meetings. So 2 minutes. The programming was really determined by that, and the initiative that I mentioned about the piloting of the rezoning. So we worked with the Department of City Planning, who then used a lot of this work and our joint work together as the basis for the current rezoning of the neighborhood. And that took many of the considerations of the community into account, and in particular around food, trying to increase the opportunity for commercial underlays on major corridors in the rezoning, and also some increased density. And I think the community overall has really struggled with the city around the rezoning, and we don't have a lot of time to get into all of those issues here, but the issues are really not related to what we're talking about for the most part. Now, the density issues and the programming issues are not a concern of the community, and I think that's really important to take into consideration. These standalone developments like Pathmark, for example, is not what we're talking about here. We're talking about mixed-use development, and we're in a place now, say 20 years ago, so we were struggling and working together on policy to not just have residential development and just residential development. So we actually, in some ways, have come a long way, because that was a big accomplishment. So the fact that now we're talking about more specificity is a great place to be, and I think the fact that the communities have become quite sophisticated and can acknowledge the fact that there is a need for increased density to make some of this programming work is really important. The last couple things I'll add, and then I'll try to work all of my points in during the Q&A, is that the planning initiative that we undertook with the community was something in the works for at least 5 years or so before the rezoning started by the city, which of course was really unexpected. But we were more positioned than others, and we had funding. It really takes funding to support a community to do this work. And so any formalization really requires there being capacity in a community, and that's very difficult to build. And it is democracy, which means that it's messy and it's time-consuming, and that's taken into account, and it's very difficult to do that within the time span, say, of a mayoral mandate or so. So thinking long-term is critically important. And then the other thing about zoning, I mean, in some ways it is true, 1961 was the last major overhaul of the zoning code, and there are constant alterations to it, but it's still RC and M. Residential commercial manufacturing. And there have been many proposals that are innovative to really rethink what zoning is. New York City, we think of it in a very particular way, but other cities actually do approach it differently. And some cities don't have zoning, and I'm not advocating for that, but there are different ways to approach what we do. So I'm probably out of time, and I'll leave it at that.